Welcome back to Shadowed Pages, my dear friends. I'm Edward, and I'm truly delighted to have you join me once again this evening. Where are you tuning in from today, and how has your day been? I always enjoy hearing from you. Leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now, let's begin. The crisp winter air hung heavy with the scent of pine and freshly fallen snow as Miss Marple made her way toward the St. Mary's Church for the annual Winter Carol service. The town of St. Mary's was bathed in the soft glow of lamplights, casting shadows on the cobblestone streets. Though it was a time of celebration, there was a quiet tension that seemed to linger beneath the festive decorations, as if something unseen was waiting to unravel. The church stood at the heart of the village, its ancient stone walls a witness to generations of whispered secrets and untold stories. Tonight, it was a place of warmth and light, filled with the sound of carols and the soft murmur of familiar voices. Miss Marple, wrapped in her thick woolen shawl, entered through the heavy oak door, her eyes scanning the crowd. The service was already in full swing, the choir singing in harmonious unison, their voices rising in the cool evening air. The congregation was made up of old friends, neighbors, and families, all gathered to celebrate the season's joys. But Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the front pew where a tall, distinguished man sat, his face stern and unreadable. His name was Edward Fairfax, the local landowner, and a man who had, over the years, earned both admiration and suspicion from the villagers. His wealth and influence gave him power, but there were always murmurs about how he had gained it. As Miss Marple made her way down the aisle, she exchanged pleasantries with several familiar faces, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. It was a scene that seemed peaceful, even idyllic, yet something in the air told her that peace would not last. The carolers sang on, their voices rising in the harmony of the season, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She felt the stirrings of an impending storm. The service drew to a close, and the congregation slowly began to file out of the church, chattering about holiday plans and family gatherings. Miss Marple stood in the back, watching the scene unfold with a thoughtful gaze. She had never been one to partake in the grander festivities of the holiday season, preferring instead the quiet solitude of her home. But there was something about tonight that made her uneasy. As the last of the congregation left, she noticed Edward Fairfax slipping away from the crowd, his face a mask of determination. She had heard whispers, of course, whispers about his late wife, Eleanor, a woman who had been found dead under mysterious circumstances years ago. The official cause was a fall down the stairs, a tragic accident, they said, but those who had known Eleanor, those who had seen, the look in her eyes just before her death, spoke of a different story. It was a story of secrets, of fear, and of a marriage that had been anything but happy. Miss Marple shook her head, dismissing the thoughts as idle gossip. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. A figure hidden in the shadows of the churchyard. It was a man, tall and slender, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The figure stepped forward, revealing a familiar face. It was James Huntley, the young solicitor who had recently returned to St. Mary's after years of living in London. "Miss Marple?" he greeted her, his voice low and polite, though there was an edge to it. "I must speak with you." Miss Marple regarded him calmly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What is it, Mr. Huntley?" "I'm afraid something dreadful has happened," he said, his face pale. "A murder, Miss Marple. Edward Fairfax. He's dead." The words hit Miss Marple like a cold wind. She had suspected that something was wrong, but to hear it so plainly, so suddenly, left her with a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "How?" she asked, her voice steady. "He was found in his study, just after the service," Huntley explained. "Shot, point blank. There's no doubt it was murder." "Have the authorities been informed?" Miss Marple asked, already assessing the situation in her mind. "They've been called, but—" Huntley hesitated. glancing over his shoulder nervously. "There's something strange, Miss Marple. I don't believe the police will be able to solve this." Miss Marple's curiosity piqued. "Why do you say that?" Huntley shifted uncomfortably. Because the evidence points to someone who was already in the house before the murder occurred, and no one else was in there with him. I don't know how it could have happened." Miss Marple considered this. "Someone already inside. That is indeed an intriguing detail. I shall come with you, Mr. Huntley. We must see for ourselves." Together they made their way through the snow-covered churchyard, the moonlight casting long shadows across the path. As they approached Fairfax's grand estate, a sense of foreboding settled over Miss Marple. She had been to the Fairfax estate many times, but never under such circumstances. The estate was quiet, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath their feet. Inside, the house was dark, except for the faint glow of lights in the study, where Edward Fairfax's lifeless body had been discovered. As they entered, Miss Marple's eyes immediately swept the room. The study was grand, filled with shelves of books, antique furniture, and heavy curtains that blocked out the cold night air. But it was the sight of Fairfax's body that held her attention. He lay slumped over his desk, a single gunshot wound to the head. The pistol that had ended his life lay nearby, discarded on the floor. Miss Marple knelt by the body, her sharp eyes scanning the room for any clue, any detail that might reveal the truth. The study was immaculate, nothing out of place. Yet the air seemed thick with something unspoken. There was something about the scene, something that didn't quite add up. She knew the answer was here, hidden in the shadows of this room, waiting for her to uncover it. She stood, her eyes narrowing with determination. "Mr. Huntley," she said quietly, "I believe we have much more to learn about Edward Fairfax and the people who knew him." Huntley nodded, his face pale, but Miss Marple was already thinking ahead. She would uncover the truth, no matter how deep the secrets ran, and she would not rest until the mystery of Edward Fairfax's death was solved. The following morning was overcast, a dull grey sky that hung low over the village of St. Mary's. The snow, which had fallen in thick, pristine layers the night before, now lay dirty and trampled, the ground beneath it hardening with the weight of the passing hours. Miss Marple was sitting at her small kitchen table, sipping tea from a delicate china cup, her mind occupied with the events of the previous evening. Edward Fairfax's murder was no ordinary crime. It was a riddle wrapped in silence, each detail more puzzling than the last. She had slept little, her thoughts turning over the events in the Fairfax estate study. The body, the gun, the absence of struggle. It all suggested something, but what? It was too neat, too controlled. Fairfax had been a powerful man, used to getting what he wanted, and yet there had been no sign of resistance, no sign of a struggle. He had simply sat at his desk as if waiting for someone, and then, perhaps, let them end his life. The questions weighed heavily on Miss Marple. Who had been the one to end his life? Why did they choose such a quiet, seemingly private place to do so, and why had there been no sign of forced entry? Fairfax's grand estate was equipped with the latest locks and alarms, yet no one had heard a sound. She stood up and crossed the room, setting her tea down and walking over to the window. The village outside was quiet, a stillness that matched her own thoughts. She had lived long enough to know that even in the most peaceful of places, there were always undercurrents, small fractures in the veneer of civility. It was in those cracks where the truth often hid. Her mind turned to the others who had been close to Fairfax, his family, his friends, the people who had attended last night's service. Edward had been well known, but not always liked. He had built his wealth through his family's estate, but many believed that his methods were less than honorable. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to his late wife, Eleanor. The circumstances surrounding her death had always been shrouded in mystery, and though the official report had deemed it an accident, there were whispers that Fairfax had been involved. Eleanor had been a beautiful woman but it was rumored that her marriage to Fairfax had been anything but happy. She recalled the look on his face the night before, his tight-lipped demeanor, his piercing gaze that seemed to scrutinize everyone and everything around him. Fairfax had been a man who hid his emotions well, who kept a tight control over his life and those in it. But Miss Marple had seen it, the way his eyes had flickered with something, guilt, perhaps, as he had left the church. It was as though he knew something was coming, that something inevitable was about to happen. There were others in the village, of course, who had their own reasons for resenting Fairfax. He had a history of disputes with his neighbors, many of whom had been forced to sell their lands to him over the years, unable to compete with his wealth and influence. Miss Marple thought back to the previous night, to the way some of the villagers had cast sidelong glances at him, their smiles strained, as if they knew secrets he was trying to keep hidden. She had seen it all, the small gestures, the hidden animosities that spoke louder than words. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft tap of a knock at her door. Miss Marple turned, recognizing the familiar sound of James Huntley's knock. He had been to her home many times over the years, seeking her advice on legal matters, and though she could tell he was not comfortable with her methods, he trusted her. He was the only one besides the police who knew what had happened at Fairfax's estate last night. And Miss Marple knew he was seeking her help now, whether he would admit it or not. She opened the door, greeting him with a calm smile. "Good morning, Mr. Huntley. I trust you have news." Huntley stepped inside, his face drawn tight with concern. "Miss Marple, He paused, his eyes darting to the tea kettle on the stove. "Would you mind if I sat for a moment? I've had a rather unsettling morning." Miss Marple gestured for him to take a seat. "Of course, Mr. Huntley. What is troubling you?" He sat down, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "It's the police. They're going over the house now, but they haven't found anything substantial. No witnesses, no signs of forced entry. Nothing. They keep focusing on the gun, Miss Marple. The gunshot wound, the way it was all done so neatly. But there's something they're missing." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "What is it that they're missing, Mr. Huntley?" Huntley hesitated. "It's the timing. Fairfax was killed just after the service, but the rest of the household didn't hear anything. No one heard the shot. And there's one thing that keeps nagging at me. The gun, it wasn't his." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Not his?" "No," Huntley replied, his voice low. "I've seen Fairfax's collection of firearms. He was meticulous about them, kept them in a locked cabinet, well cared for. But the gun that killed him wasn't one of his. It was an old, cheaply made revolver, one that doesn't belong in a man of his status." Miss Marple leaned forward, her mind turning. An unfamiliar gun, no struggle, a clean, controlled murder. It was almost as if Fairfax had been expecting the killer, had allowed them in. But why? "Tell me, Mr. Huntley," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Who would have had access to this gun?" Huntley's eyes shifted. "There's only one person who comes to mind, but it's impossible." "Who?" Miss Marple pressed. Huntley hesitated again, his eyes darkening with the weight of what he was about to say. "His son, Robert, but he's been missing for over a year. No one's heard from him since the argument that drove him away." Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her eyes never leaving Huntley's. "I believe we need to learn more about Robert Fairfax and the people he associated with." Huntley nodded slowly, as if the truth was starting to come into focus. "I agree, Miss Marple. We must find out where he is and what part he plays in all of this." Miss Marple stood, her mind already working. It was time to find the missing pieces of this puzzle, and she had a feeling that Robert Fairfax held the key to it all. The air in St. Mary's was colder than usual that afternoon, the crispness biting at the skin as Miss Marple made her way down the narrow, winding road toward the village library. She had thought long and hard about Robert Fairfax and the strange absence of any word from him since the argument with his father. missing for a year, yet his name seemed to hover over the investigation like a shadow. A name no one dared to speak openly, but one that carried its own weight. She needed to know more about Robert, about the man who had vanished into thin air and whose absence now seemed to pulse with significance. As she passed the rows of quaint weathered cottages, her mind churned with possibilities. Huntley's revelation that Robert had been estranged from his father, Edward, was hardly surprising. The Fairfax family had always been a study in secrets, its members wrapped in layers of pride, anger, and ambition. The argument, as it had been described to Miss Marple, had been one of those sudden, sharp bursts of emotion that tore relationships apart. Edward had refused to speak of it since, though the gossip had spread like wildfire throughout the village. Robert had been young, headstrong, but there was something else. The way the locals spoke of him, the slight edge of fear in their voices. That, Miss Marple knew, was always a clue. The library door creaked as Miss Marple pushed it open, the scent of old books filling the air. Inside, the library was a comforting refuge from the outside world, its rows of dusty shelves and the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock at the far corner offering a sense of timelessness. She knew the librarian well, an elderly woman named Mrs. Larkspur, who had been the keeper of the library for as long as Miss Marple could remember. Mrs. Larkspur was a woman of few words but great knowledge, particularly when it came to the history of St. Mary's and its inhabitants. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple." Mrs. Larkspur greeted her from behind the counter, her glasses perched low on her nose as she turned a page of the ledger she was reading. "What brings you to the library today?" Miss Marple smiled gently, her mind already focused on the task at hand. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Larkspur. I was hoping you could assist me in finding some information on Robert Fairfax. I understand he had a rather tumultuous relationship with his father, Edward." Mrs. Larkspur's eyes flickered slightly, a subtle change in expression that Miss Marple noticed immediately. She had known the librarian long enough to recognize the flickers of recognition or hesitation that betrayed more than words ever could. Mrs. Larkspur cleared her throat before answering. "Robert Fairfax," she repeated thoughtfully, as though the name weighed heavy on her tongue. "Well, there's not much in the public records, you know. He left quite suddenly, disappeared, and there's been nothing since. But if it's the history you want, I can show you some things." Miss Marple nodded, her curiosity piqued. "Yes, I would be most grateful." Mrs. Larkspur moved slowly, her steps echoing in the quiet room as she led Miss Marple to the back section of the library where the oldest records were kept. The room smelled of aged paper and leather, the pages yellowed with time. She pulled out a large, dusty volume and opened it carefully, her fingers brushing over the pages as she flipped through them. "Here we are," Mrs. Larkspur said, her voice soft. "Robert Fairfax. He was always a bit of a mystery, wasn't he? Young, impetuous, and full of fire. But he had a dark side, some would say." She looked at Miss Marple as if considering whether to continue. Miss Marple watched her closely, her mind already working. "Tell me, Mrs. Larkspur, what do you mean by a dark side?" The librarian hesitated for a moment, then sighed as if deciding to speak freely. It was mostly rumors, of course, but there were whispers that Robert was involved in some unsavory dealings before he left. Nothing concrete, mind you, but enough for people to talk. Some said he was spending time with the wrong crowd, perhaps even dabbling in something dangerous. Gambling, maybe, or worse. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And his relationship with his father?" "Ah," Mrs. Larkspur sighed again, her gaze distant. "Edward Fairfax was a man of great pride, and he had high expectations for his son. Robert wasn't interested in inheriting the estate or taking on his father's business interests. He was more interested in adventure, in life beyond the estate's walls. That caused quite a bit of friction between them. The argument, well, it was the breaking point. Robert disappeared after that. He was angry, and it seems he wanted nothing to do with his father's world anymore. Some say he left to escape, others that he was pushed out. Miss Marple's mind turned over the librarian's words. Robert's anger, his apparent rejection of his father's world, it was a piece of the puzzle, but it was still incomplete. If Robert had indeed vanished, then how had he returned now, in connection with his father's murder? And if he had been angry enough to cut ties with his family, why would he return to kill Edward? Was there any mention of a woman in Robert's life? Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but probing. Mrs. Larkspur blinked, her brow furrowing in thought. A woman? Well, there were rumors of one, yes. A local girl, I believe. I can't remember her name now, but she worked at the village inn. Robert was seen with her a few times before he left. Some thought she might have been the reason for his leaving. There were whispers of a scandal, but that's all it was. Whispers. Miss Marple's interest piqued further. A woman. A scandal. This could be the missing link. If Robert had left because of a woman, perhaps the reasons behind his disappearance were tied to something personal. Something far deeper than just a strained father-son relationship. Do you have any other records on Robert Fairfax? Miss Marple asked, her tone becoming more insistent. Mrs. Larkspur hesitated for a moment, then nodded. There is one more thing. She pulled out a small leather-bound folder from a nearby shelf. This is a more recent record. It's not part of the public record, but I think it might interest you. Miss Marple took the folder from her hands and opened it carefully. Inside, she found a letter dated only a few months ago, addressed to the Fairfax estate. The letter was short and written in a neat hand, though it was unsigned. I am returning. There is unfinished business to attend to. I will be coming home soon. The words sent a shiver down Miss Marple's spine. Robert Fairfax had been closer than anyone realized. His return was not a coincidence. It was purposeful, driven by something hidden. And now it seemed that business had finally caught up with him. Thank you, Mrs. Larkspur, Miss Marple said softly, her mind already racing with the possibilities. You've been most helpful. As she left the library, the wind had picked up, the cold biting at her cheeks. But she was no longer concerned with the weather. Robert Fairfax had returned, and with him, the final piece of the puzzle had just slipped into place. The day after her visit to the library, Miss Marple found herself once again on the outskirts of the village, this time making her way to the local inn. The day had been filled with distractions, small, nagging details that had prompted her to dig deeper into Robert Fairfax's sudden return. But she had a feeling the answers she sought might lie in the unspoken memories of those who had witnessed his time in St. Mary's before his disappearance. The inn, though a simple establishment, had seen its fair share of drama over the years. It was here that rumors about Robert had started, as though the walls themselves whispered of his secret life. As she approached the inn, the low murmur of voices from within spilled into the street, a sign that it was more than just a quiet haven for weary travelers. The inn was where the villagers gathered, where gossip flowed as freely as the ale. And in St. Mary's, there was no better place to uncover hidden truths than among those who believed themselves to be outsiders looking in. The bell above the door jingled softly as Miss Marple entered, her presence drawing only the briefest glance from a few patrons. The innkeeper, a stout man named Bill, nodded in acknowledgement. He had known Miss Marple for years, having witnessed her discreet inquiries in the past, and had come to respect her sharp mind. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple." Bill greeted her with a warm smile, though his eyes hinted at something more, perhaps recognition of the unspoken nature of her visit. "Good afternoon, Bill," she replied, her voice as polite and unassuming as ever. "I wonder if I could have a word with you, eh? It's about Robert Fairfax." Bill's expression flickered, but he quickly masked it with a neutral smile. "Ah, Robert Fairfax. That lad sure stirred things up in his time here. What can I help you with?" Miss Marple took a seat at the bar, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "I'm trying to piece together some details about his life before he left. You see, Robert's recent disappearance was never fully explained, and I believe there may be more to the story than most realize. Bill glanced over his shoulder, ensuring that the few patrons who remained were engaged in their own quiet conversations. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Robert Fairfax was trouble, Miss Marple. A fine young man in some ways, but he had a lot of fire in him. Came from a wealthy family, didn't want much to do with the estate or his father's business. He had plans of his own, you know. Miss Marple nodded, her interest piqued. Plans of his own? I've heard rumors of a woman in his life, a woman who might have been involved in his leaving. Bill shifted uncomfortably, his eyes narrowing. Aye, there was a woman. That's where the trouble started, really. Her name was Margaret, I think. She worked here, served drinks mostly, but she wasn't like the other girls in the village. She had a bit of a reputation, you might say. Reputation? Miss Marple asked, raising an eyebrow. Bill hesitated, as though weighing whether he should continue. Finally, he spoke again, his voice lowered further. She had a way with men, you see. A bit too much of a way, if you ask me. Robert, he got involved with her, and it didn't sit right with the old man, Edward Fairfax. I don't know what went on behind closed doors, but I do know this. Robert and his father fought over her. Fought hard. Miss Marple listened intently, her mind connecting the dots. If Robert had been so determined to leave, so desperate to escape his father's influence, it made sense that a woman could be a catalyst. But there was something deeper about this Margaret, something that Bill wasn't saying. And Margaret, Miss Marple pressed. Where is she now? Bill shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the room as if unsure whether to continue. Margaret. She left, Miss Marple, after Robert disappeared. Some say she left to start fresh, but others say she took up with someone else. Another man from out of town. No one saw her much after that, and she hasn't been back to St. Mary's in ages. Miss Marple absorbed this quietly. A woman who had been central to Robert's departure, whose presence had caused a rift between father and son, and yet she had vanished from the village. It was curious, to say the least. It seemed that there were no easy answers here, only more questions. Thank you, Bill, Miss Marple said, standing up from the bar. I appreciate your honesty. Is there any chance you could remember if Robert had any other connections in the village? Any other people he spent time with, particularly before he left? Bill scratched his chin thoughtfully. Well, Robert did spend some time with young James Huntley. They were good friends, or so it seemed. The solicitor lad, you know him? Miss Marple's pulse quickened slightly. James Huntley. He had already been involved in the investigation. His connection to Robert Fairfax was worth looking into. She had already suspected that Huntley's role in the investigation might be more than just that of a concerned outsider. I see, she replied calmly, her thoughts already turning toward the next step. I'll speak to Mr. Huntley then. Thank you for your help, Bill. As she stepped out into the cold air again, her thoughts were a whirlwind of possibilities. Margaret, Robert's estranged relationship with his father, and now a connection to James Huntley. It all seemed to be leading her to a larger story, one that stretched further than just a son's rebellion. There were layers to this mystery, layers that Miss Marple knew she had to peel back one at a time. The path was becoming clearer, but there was still much to uncover. Robert Fairfax had returned, and with his return, the quiet, unassuming village of St. Mary's was about to reveal the hidden truths that had been buried beneath the surface for so long. It was a mystery that would demand all of Miss Marple's skill to unravel, but she was ready. She always was. The sun was setting as Miss Marple made her way to the small, ivy-clad building that housed James Huntley's office. The air had grown colder with the approach of evening, and the soft crunch of her footsteps on the gravel path was the only sound accompanying her thoughts. She had spent the afternoon gathering pieces of the puzzle, but it was only now, as the shadows stretched long across the village, that the full weight of the mystery began to settle in. Robert Fairfax's sudden return, his complex relationship with his father, the whispers surrounding Margaret, And now, James Huntley's connection to it all. There was no question that the solicitor had a part to play. The question was, how much of a part? Huntley's office was quiet when Miss Marple entered, the only sign of life a small lamp burning on the corner of his desk. The shelves were stacked with neatly organized legal volumes, and a soft chair sat invitingly across from his. Huntley himself was seated behind the desk, scribbling something in a ledger. When he looked up and saw Miss Marple, a flicker of something, surprise perhaps, crossed his face, quickly masked by his usual professional demeanor. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, his voice smooth but edged with tension. "What brings you here this evening?" "I trust you don't mind a little interruption, Mr. Huntley?" Miss Marple asked politely, taking a seat across from him without waiting for a response. She had always prided herself on her ability to make people feel at ease, even when they were standing on the precipice of something unsettling. Huntley glanced at her for a moment, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "Of course, Miss Marple. What can I do for you?" "I was hoping you could shed some light on a few details I've uncovered regarding Robert Fairfax," Miss Marple began, watching his expression closely. "You and he were quite close, were you not?" Huntley's posture stiffened slightly, though he kept his voice steady. "Robert and I were friends once, yes, but that was a long time ago. He left St. Mary's, and I haven't seen him since." Miss Marple noted the way he said it, the subtle emphasis on the word left. It was clear that Huntley had his own reasons for distancing himself from Robert's departure. "Yet, you still remember him quite well, I imagine." "I remember him, yes. But that's not to say I'm involved in whatever he's done now, Miss Marple. I can't help you with his return." Huntley's tone was defensive, but Miss Marple could see through it. There was something hidden behind his words, something he was not willing to reveal just yet. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle but probing. "But you must admit, Mr. Huntley, that his return is rather significant, don't you think? Edward Fairfax's death and Robert's sudden reappearance. There's a connection, surely." Huntley shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding her gaze for a moment. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what you're suggesting, Miss Marple. I've already told the police everything I know. I've been nothing but cooperative." "I'm not accusing you of anything, Mr. Huntley," Miss Marple said calmly. "But I do believe there are gaps in the story, gaps that only someone close to Robert might understand." She paused for a moment, letting her words settle before continuing. "Tell me about Margaret." At the mention of her name, Huntley's expression darkened. "Margaret? I don't know what you expect me to say about her. She was a part of Robert's life, yes, but she's long gone. She left St. Mary's after Robert disappeared. She didn't play a role in any of this." "Didn't she?" Miss Marple pressed. "You don't think it's strange that Robert, who had severed ties with his father, would return now, only after years of silence, and that a woman, Margaret, seems to be tied to his departure?" Huntley stiffened, his eyes narrowing as if Miss Marple had hit too close to the mark. "I told you before, Miss Marple. Robert left because he wanted nothing more to do with his father or the life his father wanted for him. As for Margaret, well, I'm not sure what she had to do with it. I didn't ask him about her. That's private business." Miss Marple regarded him steadily, weighing his words. It was clear that Huntley was hiding something, but whether it was out of guilt or fear, she couldn't yet say. "I understand that, Mr. Huntley. But sometimes the private business of one man can have wider implications, don't you think?" Huntley's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, Miss Marple saw a flicker of something dark cross his face. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. He looked away, then back at her, his expression suddenly weary. "What do you want from me, Miss Marple?" "I don't want anything from you, Mr. Huntley," Miss Marple replied. "I merely want the truth. You've been close to this story from the beginning, whether you want to admit it or not. I believe you know more than you're letting on." Huntley exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping slightly as if the weight of the conversation had become too much. He leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that was almost pleading. "I can't tell you everything, Miss Marple. Some things are better left buried." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her resolve was firm. "If you want to see this mystery solved, Mr. Huntley, you'll need to share more. The truth is never as simple as we would like it to be, but the longer we wait, the more difficult it becomes to untangle the lies." Huntley seemed to weigh her words for a long time, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought he might retreat into silence. But then, finally, he spoke, his voice low and reluctant. "You're right, I've kept things from you, things I thought were better left untouched, but now I can see that there's no escaping this." Miss Marple's heart quickened. She had known it all along. The story was bigger than Robert, bigger than Edward. There were layers to this mystery, and they were finally starting to unravel. "Tell me what you know, Mr. Huntley," she said softly. "Together, we'll get to the truth." The following day dawned with a biting cold that seemed to seep through the very walls of St. Mary's. Miss Marple had spent the night in deep thought, mulling over the revelations that had come to light in her conversation with James Huntley. She had learned more than she had expected, but still there was a sense that the puzzle was far from complete. Huntley's reluctant admission had opened doors, but he had stopped short of revealing everything. His connection to Robert Fairfax was undeniable, but there was more, something he was hesitant to speak of. Miss Marple knew that her next step would be to visit the Fairfax estate again. The atmosphere at the scene of the crime had unsettled her, but it was there that she believed the final piece of the puzzle would fall into place. Fairfax's grand house, with its looming shadows and hidden corners, seemed to echo with the secrets it held. As she walked through the village toward the estate, she noticed how still the morning was. The usual hum of daily life seemed muted, as if the town was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable next revelation. The estate loomed ahead, its iron gates standing tall and imposing. Miss Marple could see the silhouette of a figure at the entrance, a uniformed constable who had been assigned to guard the scene. The police had been busy combing through the property since the discovery of Edward Fairfax's body, and though Miss Marple had not been formally invited back, she knew that she had to see it for herself. She approached the constable, who greeted her with a stiff nod. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice respectful but cautious. "I've been instructed not to let anyone through, but if you've business with the estate, I'll fetch Inspector Moore for you." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I'm afraid I don't need to speak with Inspector Moore today. I simply wish to have a look around, if you don't mind. I'm sure you understand my interest given the circumstances." The constable hesitated for a moment, then gave her a long look. Something in her demeanor made him pause, as if he knew better than to argue with the village's most astute observer. He stepped aside, giving her a small nod of permission. "I'll keep an eye out, Miss Marple. Just don't go too far." With a quiet murmur of thanks, Miss Marple passed through the gates and made her way toward the house. The estate was more imposing up close, its stone walls weathered and worn by time, yet still standing firm against the passage of years. As she walked through the manicured grounds, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the history it held. It had been a place of power, of privilege, but now it was tainted with blood. She entered the house through a side door, the one that led into the servants' quarters. It was a quieter way in, less likely to attract attention. The hallways were dim, the floors creaking beneath her weight as she moved through the house. The atmosphere inside was still and heavy, as if the walls themselves were steeped in sorrow. She could see the faintest traces of what had once been a home, a photograph of Edward and Eleanor Fairfax hanging crookedly on the wall, a forgotten vase on a table gathering dust. But it was the study that called to her, the room where Edward had met his end, and where the clues she sought were surely hidden. The door to the study was slightly ajar. Miss Marple pushed it open and stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. The study was a large, opulent space filled with dark wood furniture and towering bookshelves. The scent of tobacco still lingered in the air, a faint reminder of the life that had once thrived here. Edward Fairfax had been a man of wealth and status, but now there was only emptiness. The desk, once a place of power and influence, stood cold and silent, the papers that had been scattered across it the night of the murder still lying undisturbed. Miss Marple's gaze fell on the floor, where the faint outline of a struggle could still be seen, the carpet slightly askew, as if someone had been pushed or had stumbled in their final moments. The gun, too, had not been moved, its position telling its own story. It had been discarded quickly, too quickly for someone who might have planned this crime. She crouched down, her fingers brushing the carpet where the body had fallen. There was something about the position of the body that still didn't sit right with her. Edward Fairfax had been a man in control, but the way he had been found, slumped at his desk, a single gunshot wound to the head, spoke of a man who had surrendered, who had expected this. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound from the hallway, a creak, the soft shuffle of footsteps. Miss Marple rose quickly, stepping back from the desk and retreating into the shadows. She wasn't alone. The footsteps grew louder, and soon the figure of James Huntley appeared in the doorway. He was dressed in a dark coat, his face tense as his eyes scanned the room. He froze when he saw her, a brief flicker of surprise crossing his features before he quickly masked it with a more composed expression. "Miss Marple," Huntley said, his voice low, almost cautious. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same question, Mr. Huntley," she replied softly, her gaze never leaving him. "I assume you've come to retrieve something?" He looked down, clearly uncomfortable, before stepping further into the room. "I had to check on a few things," he muttered. "The police are still sifting through everything, but there are things I need to understand." He paused, glancing at the desk where Edward had fallen. "This whole thing doesn't sit right with me. The gun, the way it happened, there's something missing." Miss Marple studied him carefully. His unease was palpable, but it was also something more. He wasn't here just to check on the investigation. There was a personal stake in this, something deeper than he was willing to admit. She felt the threads of the mystery tightening, and she knew that Huntley, for all his deflection, was hiding something. "I believe you know more than you're telling, Mr. Huntley," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but firm. "You've been too involved in this from the start, and now it's time for the truth." Huntley's face tightened, and for a moment he looked as if he might argue, but then he exhaled sharply, as though deciding he had no choice. "You're right," he said softly. "There's more to this. But it's not what you think. It's not about Robert. It's about what's been hidden in this house for years. Edward, he knew something, and now it's all coming to light." The tension in the room was palpable, the silence thick with the weight of unspoken words. Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed on James Huntley, her mind working furiously as he stood before her, his face drawn with the burden of whatever secret he was about to share. The air felt suddenly colder, the shadows of the grand study lengthening with the fading light outside. Huntley was not the man he had seemed, the polished solicitor with his carefully constructed facade. There was something in his eyes now, something broken, as if the truth was clawing at him, demanding release. Huntley shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around the collar of his coat as if seeking some comfort from the fabric. He avoided her gaze for a moment, his eyes darting toward the floor. Then, with a deep breath, he spoke. "Edward Fairfax wasn't the man everyone thought he was, Miss Marple. He wasn't just a wealthy landowner, a proud father. He had darker dealings, things that were hidden even from his own family." His voice faltered, but he steadied himself before continuing. "I wasn't just his solicitor. I was involved in something else with him, something I should have never been." Miss Marple's heart quickened, her instinct telling her that this was the turning point, the moment the case would unfold in a new direction. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "What was it, Mr. Huntley? What did you get involved in?" Huntley's eyes finally met hers, his expression grim. "It was a business deal, a secret one, a deal that had to be kept quiet because if it came out, it would ruin everything. Edward had connections, dangerous ones, people he owed favors to, people who used him as a pawn in a much larger game, and I..." He hesitated, swallowing hard. "I was a part of it. I didn't know how deep it ran, how far he had gone to cover it all up." Miss Marple absorbed his words, her mind racing. She had suspected as much, that the death of Edward Fairfax had more layers than a simple family dispute. But this was something far more complex. "You're saying Edward Fairfax was involved in illegal activities?" "Not just illegal," Huntley replied bitterly. "I'm saying he was involved in something much darker, something that involved threats, coercion. He was laundering money, working with people who had no problem silencing those who got in their way. I thought I was just handling legal matters for him. But it wasn't just that. I was helping cover things up, making sure that nothing came to light, that no one would suspect a thing." Miss Marple's mind flicked to the things she had noticed in the house, the hidden tension, the hushed conversations, the guarded manner in which people had spoken of Edward. It was all starting to make sense. "And Robert," she said softly, her voice cutting through the weight of the revelation. "How does he fit into all of this?" Huntley's face darkened. Robert was involved too, to an extent, but he didn't know the full extent of what his father was doing. Edward kept him at a distance from all of it. I believe Robert wanted nothing to do with his father's affairs. But that night, when he left, it was because he found out something he wasn't supposed to. He found out the truth about his father, and it tore him apart." "Did Robert confront his father?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady, though she could feel the tension mounting inside her. "No," Huntley answered quickly, almost too quickly. "No, Robert didn't confront him. He couldn't. Edward had a way of making people do what he wanted, even his own son. But Robert left. He couldn't stay in that house after learning what his father had done." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, piecing the story together. So, Robert left, and Edward was left with his secrets. But now, with Edward dead, you're telling me Robert is back because of it? Huntley looked away, the guilt on his face unmistakable. "Yes. Robert came back because he found out what had really been going on. The money laundering, the people his father owed. He came back to confront it all, to find out if there was any way to stop it. But what he didn't know was that the very people his father had been involved with, they're still here. They know about Edward's death, and they'll stop at nothing to make sure that everything stays hidden. Robert's return wasn't just for his father's legacy. It was to find out if the truth could be uncovered. But it's too late now. They won't let him do that." Miss Marple took in the gravity of Huntley's words. She could sense the fear in his voice, the desperation. This wasn't just about a son seeking closure or justice. It was about a much bigger, much more dangerous world that had quietly existed in the background. A world that had now begun to unravel, and with it, the lives of those who had been caught in its web. "Who are they, Mr. Huntley?" she asked, her voice low, though she could feel the urgency in her chest. "Who are these people?" Huntley swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't know all their names, but I know what they can do. They are people with power, with influence. They've been working behind the scenes for years, using Edward as a pawn, and now they'll want to use Robert the same way." Miss Marple felt the weight of his words. The danger that Robert faced was far greater than she had imagined. "And you?" she asked quietly. "What role do you play in this, Mr. Huntley? Why were you helping them?" Huntley flinched, his face contorting with regret. "I didn't know what I was getting into. I thought I could keep it all contained, keep it quiet. I thought I was doing the right thing by helping Edward, but I was wrong. And now I'm tangled in it all. There's no getting out." Miss Marple stood silently for a moment, considering everything he had told her. She had known from the start that there was more to this than met the eye, but now the full picture was starting to emerge. It was no longer just a case of a family torn apart by greed and secrets. It was a web of corruption, of lies that stretched far beyond the boundaries of St. Mary's. And Robert Fairfax, the estranged son, was right in the middle of it, caught between the past and a future that threatened to consume him. She turned to Huntley, her expression softening, though her resolve remained unshaken. "You've told me a great deal, Mr. Huntley, but there's one more thing I need to know. What happens next?" Huntley looked at her, his face pale and drawn. "What happens next? I don't know, Miss Marple, but I think Robert's life is in grave danger, and it's only a matter of time before they come for him." The tension in the air grew thicker as Miss Marple walked slowly back through the halls of the Fairfax estate, her mind churning with the gravity of Huntley's revelations. The shadows had lengthened, and the evening sky outside had darkened into a rich shade of purple, the first stars beginning to appear faintly above the horizon. There was a quiet sense of finality in the way the estate stood, silent, grand, and yet hiding the weight of its secrets beneath layers of history. She was certain of one thing now. The mystery of Edward Fairfax's death was no longer just about the man who had been found in the study with a bullet to his head. It was about the forces he had aligned himself with, the deals he had made, and the price of those deals. Robert Fairfax's return, once a simple matter of a son seeking answers, had now turned into a race against time. Time to stop a shadowy network from burying the truth. But there was something else. A nagging feeling, a piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. As she stood in the middle of the hall, her eyes wandering over the family portraits that adorned the walls, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Something had changed in the way she viewed the entire situation. Robert's involvement with his father's illicit dealings, Margaret's mysterious role, Huntley's reluctant involvement, everything seemed to point toward a single, looming question. Why had Edward been killed now? Why had the people behind him, whoever they were, decided to strike at this moment? It was clear that Robert had come back to uncover the truth, but there had been no indication that he had made any move to expose the family's dark secrets. Had Edward's death been preemptive, a way to silence a man who might have spoken too much in his final years? Miss Marple's steps slowed as she passed the study once more. The door was slightly ajar, and she couldn't resist the pull to return, to observe the room where so much had been left unresolved. She pushed it open quietly and stepped inside. The heavy scent of leather and paper still lingered, a reminder of the life Edward had led. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the ticking of a clock somewhere far in the corner of the house. Miss Marple's eyes fell on the desk, where she had last seen the telltale signs of Edward's final moments. The room seemed unchanged, but to her trained eye there was a subtle difference. Her gaze landed on a drawer, one she had not noticed before. It was slightly ajar, as if someone had carelessly left it open. She moved closer, her fingers grazing the polished wood as she slid it open. Inside, she found a small, inconspicuous box. It was simple, made of dark wood, nothing special about it, but Miss Marple could sense its importance. She carefully lifted it out, setting it on the desk before her. The lid opened with a soft creak, revealing a few pieces of yellowed paper and an old, tarnished key. Miss Marple's fingers brushed over the papers, and she immediately recognized the handwriting. It was Robert's. There, in his neat script, were the words that caught her attention. For the family legacy. For what's owed. The cryptic message struck her immediately. What was Robert referring to? What had he uncovered before his father's death? The papers were a mixture of legal jargon and personal notes. And though Miss Marple could not decipher everything at once, it was clear that Robert had known more than he had let on. The key inside the box, small and aged, seemed to be another clue. Its significance remained unclear, but Miss Marple knew that it was connected to something larger, something hidden. As she closed the box and stood up, a faint noise reached her ears, footsteps, soft but distinct. Someone was approaching. Miss Marple didn't hesitate. She moved swiftly toward the door and out into the hall, but she didn't want to leave just yet. She needed to know more, needed to understand what Robert had been involved in and what secrets were hidden within this house. The footsteps grew louder, and she ducked behind a nearby pillar, pressing herself against the cool stone wall. She watched as James Huntley appeared in the doorway of the study, his face tense, his hands fidgeting as he glanced quickly around the room. He stepped inside, his gaze immediately falling on the desk, and Miss Marple could see the flicker of recognition pass over his face. He knew she had been there, knew she had found something. Huntley lingered for a moment, his back turned to her, then opened a drawer in the desk with a quiet click. He pulled something out, something small and metallic, and held it for a moment, inspecting it with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat as she saw the item in his hand, a small, familiar piece of paper, another note from Robert. Huntley's movements were slow, almost hesitant. He read the note, his eyes scanning the words before he placed it carefully back into the drawer and shut it. Then, just as quietly as he had entered, he turned and left the room, the faint sound of his footsteps retreating into the distance. Miss Marple remained hidden, her mind racing. It was clear now that Huntley knew more than he had let on. His visit to the study, his reaction to the note, it wasn't just a passing concern. There was a connection between him and Robert, one that ran deeper than Miss Marple had originally imagined. It wasn't just about the family legacy or Edward's death. It was about the power and influence that Robert had uncovered, something that Huntley was deeply involved in. And now it seemed Huntley was trying to cover his tracks. With the pieces starting to fall into place, Miss Marple knew that time was running out. The danger surrounding Robert was very real, and the more she uncovered, the more she realized that this was no longer just a case of a son seeking answers. It was about something far bigger, something that could destroy everything if it was exposed. She had to act quickly, before Huntley or anyone else could erase what was left of the truth. Miss Marple turned and left the study, the key from the box still hidden in her hand, its significance clearer than ever. She would need to find the lock it opened soon before it was too late. The game was afoot, and the final confrontation was fast approaching. The night had fallen completely over St. Mary's, the stars now visible in the deep, ink-black sky, their cold light casting an ethereal glow over the village. Miss Marple had spent the entire evening in thought, going over the pieces she had gathered, each new discovery pushing her closer to an unsettling truth. The more she uncovered, the more it became clear the game was no longer one of simple investigation. It was a race against time, a battle with forces far more dangerous than she had anticipated. The small box, the key, the note from Robert Fairfax. Everything was starting to come together, but she still didn't have the full picture. She needed to know what that key unlocked, and more urgently, she needed to get ahead of Huntley. She had seen the way he reacted to the notes she had found, the way he had been carefully covering his tracks. Huntley was tangled in something darker than he had let on, and Miss Marple knew that whatever it was, Robert Fairfax's life was at the center of it. Miss Marple walked briskly through the quiet streets toward the one place she hadn't yet dared to search, Robert Fairfax's old quarters. They were located in the farthest wing of the Fairfax estate, the part of the house that had been unused since his departure. It was the most likely place for Robert to have hidden something, anything that might explain his sudden return and the depths of the secrets he had uncovered about his father. The air had a chill to it, the kind that made the breath catch in your chest, and with each step Miss Marple took, the sense of urgency only grew. The estate loomed ahead, its darkened windows staring like eyes, watching her approach. The house had once been filled with the sound of life. Now there was only silence. She reached the entrance to Robert's wing, the door standing slightly ajar, a subtle sign that it had been disturbed recently. She pushed it open carefully, stepping inside. The dust that had accumulated over the years was thick in the air, coating every surface. It was as if time had come to a halt in this part of the house, trapping Robert's memories in suspended animation. Miss Marple's eyes flicked over the room as she crossed to the far side. The furniture, though old and worn, was still arranged with the precision of someone who had lived here not so long ago. There was a desk, now covered in a thin layer of dust, and a bookshelf, its contents stacked neatly. But it was the small drawer in the desk that caught her attention. The key in her hand seemed to hum with purpose, as though it knew it had arrived at its destination. She inserted the key into the drawer with a quiet click, and it opened easily. Inside, there was a small leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age but still intact. Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly as she picked it up, the weight of it feeling heavier than any book she had ever held. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the first page. The handwriting was unmistakable. Robert's. And what she read next confirmed her suspicions. The journal was filled with accounts of Robert's life in St. Mary's, his growing awareness of his father's business dealings, and his mounting frustration with the man who had once been his hero. It was clear from the entries that Robert had begun to piece together the secrets his father had kept hidden for years. The money laundering, the dangerous connections, the people Edward had crossed. But what struck Miss Marple most was the final entry, the one written just days before Robert had disappeared. I know too much now. I can't stay in this house any longer. If I do, they'll come for me too. I have to leave and I have to take what I know with me. But when I return, I will bring it all to light. They won't silence me. Miss Marple felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she read those words. Robert had known then what would happen to him if he stayed. But more than that, he had known that the people behind his father's dealings were powerful and dangerous, far more than she had ever imagined. His return was not just about settling old scores, it was about unfinished business, about ensuring that the truth came to light before it was buried forever. She closed the journal gently, her mind whirring with the implications of what she had just read. Robert had known the danger he faced, and yet he had come back, seeking to expose the truth, knowing full well that it could cost him his life. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a sound. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable. She moved quickly, sliding the journal back into the drawer and locking it with the key. She closed the drawer just as the door creaked open, and James Huntley stepped into the room, his face a mask of apprehension. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, almost strained. "I should have known you'd find your way here." Miss Marple stood still, her back straight, her gaze never leaving him. She had known this confrontation was inevitable. The time for subtlety was over. "You've been hiding a great deal, Mr. Huntley," she said quietly, her voice steady, though her eyes were sharp. "I know what you've been involved in, and I know why Robert came back. It's time to tell me everything." Huntley looked at her for a long moment, his hands fidgeting at his sides. He had known, just as Miss Marple had, that the truth could no longer be kept buried. He took a step forward, and for the first time his composed exterior cracked. "It was never supposed to go this far," he muttered, his voice tinged with regret. "Edward thought he could control everything, control Robert, control the people we worked with. But when Robert started asking questions, digging too deep, I had no choice but to help him leave. But I never thought he'd come back, never thought he'd uncover it all. Now you're right, you've got the pieces, and I'm not sure there's anything I can do to stop what's coming next." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her resolve remained. "There's always something that can be done, Mr. Huntley, but you must act quickly. The truth needs to be exposed before it's too late. Huntley nodded slowly, the weight of his guilt settling over him like a heavy cloak. I'll help you, Miss Marple. I'll help you stop them. But I'm afraid that no matter what we do, the damage may already be done. The tension in St. Mary's had reached its peak. The dark secrets of the Fairfax family, once hidden beneath layers of wealth and power, were finally about to come into the light. Miss Marple had done what she did best. She had observed, listened, and waited for the right moment to piece together the tangled threads of a mystery that had seemed insurmountable. Now, standing at the threshold of the final revelation, she knew that the puzzle was almost complete. It had been days since her conversation with James Huntley. Since then, she had carefully tracked down every lead, piecing together Robert Fairfax's journal, Huntley's secret involvement, and the dark underbelly of the Fairfax estate. What had seemed like a simple case of family discord had, with time, unraveled into something much more dangerous, a tale of corruption, betrayal, and murder. But Miss Marple wasn't one to be intimidated by such weighty matters. She had seen it all before, and she knew exactly what to do. That morning, the final pieces had fallen into place. The key she had found, the one that unlocked Robert's hidden drawer, had been the final clue she needed. It led her to a safe hidden behind the bookshelves of the study, Edward Fairfax's safe, which contained not only evidence of his illegal dealings but also a list of names that Robert had been gathering before his sudden departure. The names were of the people who had been pulling the strings behind Edward's empire, the ones who had stood in the shadows and controlled everything. Miss Marple had handed this evidence over to the authorities, and now she waited. She had done everything she could to ensure that Robert's name would be cleared, that the truth would be exposed. But there was one final thing that needed to be addressed. The man who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. The man who had made Robert's life so miserable that he had been forced to leave and then return, risking everything to uncover the truth. The day of the confrontation had arrived. Miss Marple had arranged a meeting at the Fairfax estate, where the authorities had gathered to bring the investigation to its final stage. She had invited Huntley to join her, but the solicitor had been notably absent. The guilt weighed too heavily on him, and he knew that he could not be a part of the final reveal. It was up to Miss Marple now, as it always had been. The room was tense when the final suspect entered. Jonathan Fairbanks, the longtime business associate of Edward Fairfax, the man who had used his connections to manipulate the dealings of the estate for his own gain. He was older now, his once imposing figure shrunk by years of deception and greed, but his eyes still held the sharpness of a man who had never been caught. He walked into the room with the same air of authority he had carried for years, but this time there was no confidence in his stride. This time, the truth was waiting for him. "Miss Marple," Fairbanks greeted her with a smile that barely touched his lips. "I hear you've been quite busy, poking around in places you shouldn't be." Miss Marple stood tall, her eyes steady. She had seen this man for what he was long before the pieces had come together. "I believe it's you who have been poking around in places you shouldn't, Mr. Fairbanks, and I believe it's time for you to answer for what you've done." Fairbanks scoffed, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "You think you've solved it, don't you? That your little game of puzzles has come to an end?" "I do," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but firm. "And I believe you know exactly what I'm talking about." The room fell silent as she pulled the documents from her bag. The evidence she had gathered from the safe, the list of names, the financial records that tied Fairbanks to the illegal operations. She laid them on the table, one by one, and watched as the man's face shifted from disdain to something darker, something like fear. He had never expected this. "You've been behind this for years, haven't you, Mr. Fairbanks?" Miss Marple said softly, her words cutting through the room. "You've been the one pulling the strings, using Edward as your pawn while you built your empire in the shadows. And when Robert found out, when he began to uncover the truth, you had him silenced. You didn't want him to ruin your plans. Fairbanks took a step back, his eyes darting toward the door as if considering escape. But Miss Marple knew better. He wasn't going anywhere. You see, Mr. Fairbanks, she continued, you underestimated Robert. He may have been angry, but he wasn't a fool. He knew exactly what you were doing. And that's why he returned, to make sure that the truth was exposed before you could bury it all. He looked at her, his face pale and drawn. You don't understand, Miss Marple. If the truth comes out, everything will fall apart. My whole life, everything I've worked for, it'll be destroyed. That's the price you pay, Mr. Fairbanks, she said, her voice soft yet resolute. When you destroy others to build your empire, you must eventually face the consequences. The truth will always find its way to the surface. Fairbanks didn't respond. He stood there, frozen in place, his entire demeanor deflated. The truth had crushed him, the weight of his actions pressing down on him until he couldn't stand any longer. Just then, the door opened, and the local police officers entered, led by Inspector Moore. They had been waiting outside, and now, with the final pieces in place, they were ready to arrest Fairbanks. The evidence was irrefutable. His role in Edward Fairfax's death, his illegal dealings, and his attempt to manipulate and silence Robert were all there, laid bare for the world to see. As the officers took Fairbanks into custody, Miss Marple stood quietly, watching the scene unfold. She had done it. She had solved the case, exposed the lies, and ensured that justice would be served. Robert Fairfax would be cleared of any wrongdoing, and the truth would come to light for all to see. The final chapter of the Fairfax family's dark history had been written, and Miss Marple, once again, had uncovered the secrets that had been buried in silence. She turned and walked out of the room, the satisfaction of a job well done settling over her like a soft cloak.